Hey guys, how we doing? I wanted to take a moment and share with you a training video that could allow us all to better cope and manage and navigate our way through this COVID-19 situation that we're currently in. So this video is a video that has a framework around some physical and mental skills. And this video is not necessarily meant to be prescriptive, but rather more of an invitation for us to seek out ways to better cope and maybe even get better that fit us. I would also like to first acknowledge that some of us might not be ready to progress just yet. The real threat is front and center for us, and trying to figure out ways to progress and move forward could be a bit premature right now. And we all have needs. We have physical needs. We need to have food, water, shelter. Many of us have that. Some people might not even have that at this time. We also have a very important need of safety. And while some of us might have the need of safety being met right now physically, we might not necessarily have the psychological need of safety in terms of us feeling secure with where we're going and what the future entails. So we might not really necessarily feel safe financially. Maybe we know someone or us or one of our family members have lost a job. And so that creates some deficiency in that need. So our aim is to reduce some of that deficiency first to try to secure some of these basic needs and to meet this threat head on before we start looking at more advanced type of skills to better cope and manage with this. So the steps that we're all taking currently right now to slow the spread are necessary and definitely remain a top priority. And while that remains a top priority for all of us, one thing that's really important is mental health as well. And when it comes to our mental health, when we have the stress over a long period of time that has taken place, most likely because we're now forced to shelter in place, we have a direct response to that and implications physically. So our aim is also to be aware of how our mental health impacts our physical health. The health impacts of this virus go far and beyond infection and disease. It's important to recognize that this stress that's brought on us by this pandemic can also trigger more of a long-term stress response biologically. So there's two kinds of stress. There's acute stress and there's chronic stress. Most of us typically respond to stress differently. Everybody's a little unique in this respect. However, there are some commonalities we typically see when it comes to the stress response, especially with acute stress. We see people that either enter into what we call fight or flight. There's freeze or there's submit. Some people freeze up. Other people, they throw their hands up and they say, you know what, I'm done with this. That's also called learned helplessness. And so while most people have their own unique way of processing stress and responding to it, there are some common triggers when it comes to that. And what's interesting is the acute stressors that we see when your heart starts to thump and something's on the line. We also see that happen when it comes to chronic stress. So we have what's called an overactive sympathetic response. When we should be relaxing and resting and digesting, we call it, we actually are switched on too much. And that is where we can have some problems. We're really all in uncharted territory. And what's interesting is even with this path that we're going through that we really don't know what the end point is we do understand how stress can trigger certain different hormones and how we respond to this. And so in terms of structure and function, we do know what's going to take place for the most part. Especially during times of heightened stress like we're in right now, we have really an overproduction of the main stress hormones. We have norepinephrine, for example, cortisol, adrenaline, even there's a hormone called adrenocorticotropic, and that's really during more of the acute stress. But these are things that are highly adaptive when it comes to real physical stressors. But the problem is when we have a perception of stress over a long period of time, and the stress could be real, right now it's real for all of us, is that it leads to some problems. This overactivation relative to all of those stress hormones that we just talked about are not healthy in the long term when it comes to our health and wellness. So let's go ahead and dive into the training and see what works for us when it comes to using particular tools. The first thing is to really look at some of the symptoms that are involved and what shows up for you. There's many symptoms that are associated with the stress response, and we will cover some of those right now. Okay, guys, we're going to talk about some of the main symptoms that are associated with stress and the stress response. There's many of them. We will talk about some of the main ones that show up. Changes in sleep patterns is one. We have appetite, so eating too much or consuming too little based on what you typically do, if that changes. Mood changes, anxiety, depression, anger, low motivation. We've definitely seen this with many of our athletes now, especially with the change of the structure. We have more of an open-endedness to the actual daily living, and that can definitely have an impact on motivation, even though there's many other things that could play a role in that. Increased risk of substance abuse, headaches, abdominal pain, digestive difficulties. And so these are all associated with an overactive stress response. And the main question to ask ourselves is, how does stress show up for you? How is it that you're taking it in, processing it? How does it show up? Where does it show up? And what kind of symptoms are associated with what you're going through relative to stress? So the first step is to identify how it shows up for you. And then the good thing is there's many tools, and we'll talk about 5 main tools that we can work with to better cope and manage this. Let's have some fun here. So this is our framework that we're going to be working from here. And there's 3 areas from the framework: is train well, think well, and be well. And so if we look at training well, that's a physical tool. We look at thinking well, that's a cognitive tool. And then we have being well, and that's more of a behavioral tool. And taken together, this is more of an integrated approach to be able to manage. And again, I want to be as clear as I can, not just manage, that is important, but also to progress and to move forward, which means we're getting better. So we have physical training, we have optimism, we have locus of control, goal setting, and mindfulness. Taken together, we want to be as well as we possibly can during these times. The first physical skill is the skill of training. First, we want to talk with our coaches to make sure that we are working out appropriately and you are using the actual training methods and modalities that your coach has prescribed. This is really important, especially right now, because there's so many different workouts and stay-at-home body weight workouts, some of which are good and some of which are not really good at all. And many professionals in this area that are trained or licensed and certified would contraindicate and altogether take out some of the training methods that are being used. So talk with your coach to make sure that you're on it. If you don't have a coach, you're not an athlete, go ahead and reach out to your local certified strength conditioning specialist. And with this, you're looking at someone who's certified through the National Strength Conditioning Association, which is the gold standard for training, highly reputable. It's just really important to make sure that we're doing the right things when it comes to looking at the rigor of the science that's involved in training and the art when it comes to training and progressing and getting better and changing workout loads and periodization and all kinds of good stuff. So talk with your coaches or professionals that are trained and licensed in this area. That is the first thing. Training is goal-directed behavior, and I don't typically use the word maybe exercising or working out, even though that's fine. Everybody has different nomenclature and vocabulary when it comes to this. But as we're working our way through this COVID-19 situation, being as structured is so important, and that is training. Training is goal-directed, objectively driven, and so the aim is to be as detailed as we can and to be as consistent as we can with our training. Movement is medicine. Without a doubt, movement allows us to establish positive mood states, well-being, and physically it impacts our immune system and the stress response. And this is the battle that we're facing right here. So moving the body physically and consistently, and how we do that is via training that we just talked about, is such a great move for us. There's some pun intended right there. Is a good move for us to be able to move our body as consistently as possible, because movement is medicine. If you're able to get outside too and move in the sun, that is really, really important, because it definitely has a direct impact on our mood states. In fact, research suggests around 20 to 30 minutes of exposure of your limbs and face nets around 10,000 to 20,000 international units of vitamin D. And so when we're looking at wellness overall, this has to be done a certain way. We want to really aim for the mid-morning or mid-afternoon to avoid the peak sun intensity. So if you do have that option, moving your body, doing it a certain way, which is training, and doing it in the sun respectively and in a healthy manner, is something that can definitely impact us in a very healthy way. The last thing here is the biggest thing, and I'm not here to really talk about, workout specificity and all kinds of training methods, but really more of how we go about our training is this: adherence and frequency. Our aim right now is to be as consistent as possible when we're at home. That is really the goal, is that we're actually completing our workouts and we are doing it over a long period of time. Tremendous amount of research in sport and exercise psychology when it comes to those that actually stick with their training methods, is that it's not necessarily the intensity. Intensity is very important. Again, always refer back to your coaches when it comes to workout load and then recovery time within that load. When it comes to sticking to training, it's really good to try to get out more frequently overall. So if you think about it, if your motivation's down, it's better just to get out and do less more frequently than it is to, for example, let's say the traditional 2-hour training block of maybe 3 days a week or 2 days a week. That does not yield the same results. In fact, training more frequently reaps better results. So we have more output the more frequently we train at less intensity. So that is when we're really talking about sticking to the training and adherence. So if you're having a hard time completing workouts, what does your workout load look like? Is it really intense for 2 to 3 hours? That's really tough. Again, you want to go back and talk to your coach, because that's the first thing you want to do. And then also communicate with your coach if your motivation's down. It could be because maybe you're not training as frequently as you could at less intensity. So again, the traditional 2 to 3 hours of training, maybe 2 days a week or 3 days a week, has not even yielded the same output as more frequent training. Again, there's many variables when it comes to that, so always talk with your coach. But the question to ask yourself is your motivation down, or have you been missing workouts? If so, you might want to adjust your intensity load and then increase your frequency at which you're moving your body. The next scale is a cognitive scale that's called optimism. And let's really tease apart what this is not first. Optimism is not a particular trait. It's not something that we're born with or even a disposition. So first and foremost, we want to be really clear that just like pessimism and optimism are learned. They are skills. And we want to be as credible as we can. Some people cringe when they hear the word like optimism or positive self-talk or being positive in general. That is not what we're talking about here. We want what's called credible self-talk. And we want to be as real as we can. And so what happens is what optimism is not is faking things, right? Meaning that self-talk dissonance is when we're telling ourselves something that doesn't really match up with the reality is. And so that's the first thing, is we want to be able to be credible when it comes to how we're viewing a situation. And the second thing is what optimism is not, is something called naive optimism. And naive optimism is when we're not really aware of what's going on in terms of the reality. So here's an example, is someone who might want to win a gold medal in the Olympics, right? But they haven't done the work. So they can be positive and optimism, but if they have not done the work, then it's not as credible as we definitely need it to be. So that's the first thing, is to really understand what optimism is not. So optimism, one way we look at it is, how do you think about the future? That's the first thing we look at. There's two ways to think about the future: optimistically and pessimistically. So optimism is a mental construct. It's a skill that we can learn. Looking for what has gone well or what will go well in the future. That is what optimism is. So really, it's a filter through which we view our future through. And so one thing that's interesting is all my experience with coaching and being a sports psych consultant, working with many different athletes at different levels, is that I have never met a athlete at a real high level, world class, or any athlete that's consistently a high performer, that's really good at doing what they do, that is not optimistic. Think about world class athletes. One thing that is highly consistent among them is that they're optimistic. It's rare that we meet a pessimistic world class athlete that has stood the test of time over many, many years. Another thing with optimism is that it correlates highly with mental toughness. If you look at anybody that really pushes themselves over a long period of time, such as, let's say, special operators like Navy SEALs, and they go through Hell Week, and they're really just putting themselves through physical exhaustion for days on end, they're optimistic. They know it's going to end, and they put that in their head that they're going to stay in things and they're just going to complete things one step at a time. That's a highly optimistic lens to look through. And so if we look at a pessimistic lens, in fact, there's some good research on this, that those that are actually just moments before they quit, one of the first things that they look at is that they can't even fathom the fact that they still have a certain amount of miles to go or hours to go. And so that's a pessimistic view of the future. So individuals that are mentally tough and they do really hard things, such as things like we're in right now that take a long time, sheltering at home for months on end, it's really hard, right? Being optimistic, we know it's going to end. We know it's going to end. We don't know exactly when, but we know it will end. We don't know how it's going to end. We might come out of this a little differently, but nevertheless, it will end. So optimism and mental toughness go together very, very well. Really some good research coming out of University of Penn with optimism. Martin Seligman, 2005, which was a 7-day study, and he looked at his subjects were either labeled as, or they were diagnosed clinically depressed or non-clinically depressed. And what he had is he had the two different groups. That he had one group, or he actually had both groups at the end of the day think about and look for what went well, something tangible that they experienced that went well that day. So essentially, they're being researchers of good. They're constantly looking for what went well. They were to write down 3 to 4 things that they actually experienced that went well for them. And then just adjacent to that statement, or whatever it is that they wrote, in parentheses, they wrote a feeling that associated with what went well for them. At the end of the 7 days, what had happened was the individuals that were clinically diagnosed with depression, their depression stabilized. And the individuals that were in the non-clinical group and subclinical group, they actually went up substantially. Their mood states went up. So there's all kinds of good things really that we're looking at here when it comes to being a researcher of good. And that's part of the training here, is that can we look at what is good from a bad situation? And there's no faking anything. It's as real as it gets, because there's negative things that we can look for, but there's also positive things. So that's part of the work, is to be a researcher of good. So here's how we actually apply this, and here's how we tangibly train optimism. Here's an example. One thing you can do is to list out 2 to 3 things from earlier today or yesterday that went well. And that should really be something tangible that went well. For example, at the end of the day, you noticed or you think back that someone opened the door for you. This is just a hypothetical example. So then in parentheses, you would write down the feeling that you got that associated with the statement or the experience that you went through. So this person put connected. So, a few statements, maybe 1 or 2 or 3, maybe just a couple to start with, and try it out. See how it works for you for 7 days or so, just like with Martin Seligman's work in this research study. This is actually how we train it, is to put the pen or pencil to paper at the end of the day to go back and look for what went well. And this is not necessarily gratitude training. It's related, but it is different. We're looking at optimism. We're training our mind to look for what is actually good, especially in the situation that we're in right now. Our next skill is a mental skill called control. Locus of control, whether we have control over our actions. So it's a perception of control. During COVID-19, think about how much control we really have over the situation, over our environment and ourselves. So really what we're looking at here is we're working from attribution theory, which is really how we explain our behavior overall. So locus of control is how we explain our behavior. However, we can also use it for future events that we're about to partake in, such as how much control do you think we have, or how much control is perceived over something that you have to do in the future. This has a really strong direct impact on stress and the stress response. So focusing on what we can control, or having a perception of the things that we can control, have direct impacts. And there's really 2 areas here. they impact our expectations. And think how important that is when we're approaching something new that we need to accomplish or get done day to day. So to the extent that we perceive we have control over something has a direct impact on our expectations. And that can impact something else called self-efficacy, which is our perception of our ability to be able to successfully complete a task. The next part is our emotional response of future events. So to the level that we have control or perceived control of a future event, if we sense that we do have internal control, then we would have a very highly adaptive emotional response to future events. Compared to not necessarily having control, then that could elicit a negative emotional response. And so this definitely ties into the stress response overall, and especially during COVID-19 when we don't really know the exact endpoint. And again, going back to that open-endedness of the structure of this whole situation. So our main goal with all of this is really to get clear about what we have control over and what we don't have control over. This is a really cool mental skill that we can use because it serves to build insight as a reminder for us to really focus in on and attend to the things that we can control and be aware of the things that we can't control. And so it serves to allow us to build some awareness around these. And it's a skill that we can train and develop daily. And there's a lot of freedom when it comes to clarity of control. And again, this has a direct impact on this stress response. So how do we apply this? How do we apply the skill of training control? So here we go. Think about this. Have a circle. So you would take out a piece of paper and draw a circle. You would have a circle like this because you drew a circle just like this right here. And the first thing you want to think about is what is it that's really important to you right now as it pertains to anything. We could talk about athletics, academics, or the COVID-19 situation. What is it that's really important to you that you do not have 100% control over? So the things that you do not have control over that's important to you, write those outside the circle here. So it could be 1 or 2 to 4 things, the top things. And typically when things are really important to you, it might be around a few or so, maybe 3 or 4. And then secondly, what is it that's really important to you that you have 100% control over? You would put that inside the circle right here. And this serves, again, just this little exercise of externalizing this to paper is that it allows us to build insight, which is awareness. And actually going to the step of writing this down builds more strength of awareness when it comes to the things that are in our control and the things that are not in our control that are important to us. Because these are the things that we're going to index on throughout the day and think about that have an impact on our stress. And this next piece is even further applied here is to maybe earlier in the day when you wake up is to write out 3 things that are in 100% of your control that you already did right here. So really focus on maybe 1 to 2 to 3 things at most in the morning. And so then at the end of the day, circle back and come back to that. And that's the metric of how we were in these 3 areas. So basically we would write out 1 to 2 to 3 things that are in our control, 100% in our control, and then just be mindful of them, have little gentle reminders throughout the day, and then come back to them at the end of the day. And from a scale of 1 to 10, how are you able to refocus back to those things that we can control? So just keeping those things front and center throughout the day serve as reminders. And tangibly, we can set our watches to, every 2 hours to remind ourselves to index on the things that we can control. And briefly here, another area that could really facilitate better internal control here is to build a routine into your day, usually starting in the morning, even though you can have what's called micro routines throughout the day right before you're about to do something such as go to a class. In athletics, this is definitely paramount here, and we work a lot on building these routines. But routines are really good because we build them ourselves, so we have control. And think about the COVID-19 situation. We don't have control over certain things, such as when it's going to end, how it's going to end. We do have control how we attend to our morning and what we do and how mindful we are when we wake up. So what's your morning routine? So there's a lot of different things out there, but really the key is to build some sort of routine. And athletes know this well because it builds a sense of control, such as a basketball player that's walking up to the free throw line. There's a lot of things they can't control, but they go inside and they have a particular 5 to 10 second routine. Maybe it's taking a deep breath, maybe it's dribbling or bouncing the ball 2 times to set their body position. And so these are not superstitions. We cannot control superstitious behavior. We do have direct control over routines. So what is your routine? And routine builds clarity, and we have direct control over our routines that can reduce stress. And so with the athletes, a lot of times I talk about CTC. Think about the CTC, and that's control the controllables. And many people have thrown this around, especially right now, control the controllables. But the main thing is, how are we doing that? How are you training this? So this is one way that we can train, which is the circle right here, writing it out, and then being about it through the day, really focusing on it and coming back to it. And when we're thinking about things we can't control, that's okay too, but then we gently refocus back to the things that we can control. And finally, this definitely bears saying this because sometimes there's things thrown around that seem easier than they are. And this is work. This takes a lot of practice because it's a skill. And so it's not about faking anything. Again, it's about being credible with what we're doing. So one thing is we can't eliminate uncontrollables from your thinking. We're not talking about that to eliminate everything outside of our control. In fact, we wouldn't want to even do that because some of the things that are outside of our control, they give us a sense of meaning. So no one's really saying to block those out 100%. What we're really saying is we want to learn when and where to place our attention at the appropriate time. And how is stress showing up for you? That's really the key. And then when we start, indexing or watering those thoughts on the things we can't control, we know where to go. We have an anchor and a foundation to where we can go back inside the circle here and really be mindful of the few things that we can control. And that's healthy. What's not is to actually deny, to try to suppress the things that are outside of our control. So it's much deeper than just eliminating those thoughts. We don't want to do that. We want to do this in a very holistic and credible way. Our next tool is goal setting, and this is a behavioral skill that we want to use. And the relationship of goal setting and performance is really complex. Locke and colleagues suggest that goals have a strong impact on us by directing our attention, mobilizing our effort, and enhancing our persistence, which have an impact on our motivation. And of course, this impact and this link here is not direct, it's more of an indirect component to performance. So we'll get better at what we do, but it's not directly related. I want to be clear on that. Goal setting has a really good impact on motivation, and motivation tends to be down right now, especially among athletes, because their whole environment has changed. In fact, they're going through some of the main stages of an athlete that's been injured right now because we're all sidelined. We cannot practice. We can train a little bit in a modified form. So goal setting can really impact our motivation in a good way. And something to think about with goal setting is when the COVID-19 has run its course, what do you want? What are the long-term goals? We know that it's going to end. We might not know how it's going to end, but we do know this. The athletes know that they're going to be back on the court somewhere down the line. They're going to be on the court. They're going to be back in the pool. They're going to be on the grass. Students are going to be sitting back in their chairs in the classroom. We know that is a fact. So what do we want? What do we want to have accomplished by the time we get back in that chair, back on the grass or on the court? What are your long-term goals for COVID-19? So 2 areas here, if we go back for the COVID-19 goals to think about, is what do you want to be when you get back on that court or on the grass? What do you want to be about? You want to be more in command of yourself? You want to be more present? You want to be you? You want to be a high performer? What is that? That's a question to think about. How do you want to be when we get back? The next one is more behavioral. What do you want to do? So what is it going to look like when you get back? And this is more achievement based. So what are some of the things that you want to accomplish by the time we get back on that court or in the water? And so these right here, we want to be meaningful as we think about these. We want them to be meaningful to us because this is what keeps us moving forward in terms of our direction and mobilizing our effort, which is motivation. To be brief, this is how we do it. to apply this is to write down your goals. And I just call them the Rona goals. You can call them whatever you'd like. What are your goals for this situation, this COVID-19, in terms of being? How do you want to be? You want to work on being more present? We've already talked about that, right? Same thing right here. What do you want to do? We want to keep these visible and review them daily. And that's the thing with goal setting, is to really write it down. If you can think it, ink it, get it down on paper, keep it front and center, and just review it a little bit each day. We want to set 1 to 2 goals daily based on our Rona goals. So really, these Rona goals of how you want to be and what you want to do when you get back to the court or the pool or your classroom, those are really long-term, we would say. So it could be anywhere from 4 weeks, we don't really know, to 6 weeks, but we do know that we'll be back. Those are more long-term goals. But we also want to set daily goals. So our daily goals are how we're going to achieve our long-term goals. And think about long-term goals like our Rona goals, those are long-term goals, as the what. It's really what you want. And then when we look at our daily goals, that is the how. That is how you're going to accomplish these goals. And if we want to really work upstream at the highest level, we would think about the why. So is your why really strong in terms of why you want that goal? So you want to think about that. Why is it that you want your goal? Is it meaningful for you? And then what is it that you want? Those are long-term goals. And then the how is the day-to-day goals and operation. And the last thing here that most people are familiar with is really how to do some of this, how to pull this together with the acronym SMART, even though I've modified it just a bit. We want to be specific with our goals, starting with that long-term goal. Let's do it right now when it comes to the COVID-19. We want to have them be measurable. So how do we know we've accomplished it? And that's really how we know it's measurable. Do you know how it's going to look for you in terms of your goal when it's done? And then the next thing is it should align with your why. So that bears repeating again, because that's very strong in terms of the meaningfulness. And then the R is that razor's edge. Does it stretch you a little bit? The razor's edge is the place where we really push ourselves when we're ready to get out of our comfort zone. And then it should be, the T is time bound. And this is tricky because we don't really know specifically why. No, let me go back on that. We don't know when we're going to get back, but we do know this. When it comes to the time in setting these goals, it would be written in such a way that when I get back on the court, when I get in the pool, when I get back in the classroom, that is really the timeline that we're looking at, compared to maybe 2 months or 3 months, because we do know we're going to get back. Our next skill that we're going to look at is mindfulness and mindfulness training, which is a behavioral skill. Now, with our athletes, we look at mindfulness and we train it as an approach. So it serves as the foundation for every other skill that we have as an anchor that the other skills stitch and thread with. And so mindfulness is paying attention in a particular way in the present moment, non-judgmentally. And that is world-renowned professor of medicine, University of Massachusetts, John Kabat-Zinn. To break down this definition here in operational terms, what we're looking at here is really to be aware, and we can train the mind to be more aware and pay attention and be where our feet are at. So we want to be aware, and then we want to use our breath. So it's a behavioral physical technique of diaphragmatic breathing, so breathing deeply. And really, the stakes could not be any higher right now when it comes to trying to train our mind to be more present right now, because the stakes are high. We have stress going on with the COVID-19, and what we tend to do is be ahead of time for the most part when we get stressed. And so being ahead of time is we're focusing and projecting into the future of what could go wrong, of the worry of the unknown. And so we could be ahead of time, or we can be behind time and thinking about, perseverating about, ruminating about some things that happened in the past, again, that we don't have any control over. And it could be working from a pessimistic lens. Or we can be on time, and that's really being at the center of a moment and being really grounded and being where our feet are at. And when we use that term, to be where our feet are at, we're looking at this notion of taking mental attendance. So physically, we might be somewhere. We might be here right now listening to this video or watching this video, but is your mind there? So taking mental attendance means that we are where our feet are at. If we think about so many opportunities that are out there for all of us, many opportunities could be lost because we're present physically, but not mentally. So the natural state of our mind is a bit erratic. It's sloppy. I mean, for all of us, if we just think about the natural calm state of our mind, it's designed to look for what's wrong. And we've already talked about optimism. I mean, can you imagine that? We're designed, evolutionarily speaking, to scan the world for danger. And so our mind, we're working in modern times using ancient tools such as our brain, and especially the limbic system that is designed to scan the world for what's wrong. So we are not designed to be optimal. We're actually not designed to be in the moment. We're always planning and looking behind, looking ahead. And so just to understand that hopefully builds a little bit of insight that an undisciplined mind, especially at a time during stress, is what exacerbates the stress. And so it's almost like a cyclical type of component here where the very fact of looking ahead and projecting ahead elicits the stress response that we already have because of the environment that we're in. So really what we're looking at here is just to be aware of the natural state of our mind is undisciplined. And even in the best of circumstances, a very disciplined mind is rare. But however, we can train it. We can definitely train our mind to come back to the moment and using our breath to be able to do that. And when we get away from the center of the moment, when we project ahead or we look back, this is where anxiety, stress, and even depression rears its head. So here's how we apply this. And it's simple. This is a simple tool and approach, but takes a lot of work to be consistent with it and to really make the time to be able to do this. And it really comes down to these areas right here. And there's many ways to do this. This is one out of a tremendous amount of different methods and modalities to train mindfulness. The first thing we would want to look at is grounding ourselves. And that means whether we're standing up or we're sitting down on a pillow or we're sitting on a mat, that we're putting our mind where we're sitting and how we're sitting. Grounding yourself is putting your mind on your feet and actually rooting your feet into the ground and just being aware that you're sitting or you're standing. If you're sitting down, you want to put your mind on your sit bones. So we call this grounding. So rooting into the ground, and then just work a little body scan. Be mindful of your posture. So we want to draw the shoulders under the ears, engage the chin. The chin's going to pull back just a little bit. And yet we're alert, but we're not really stiff. So the first thing is to think about the posture. Lift the crown of the head up towards the ceiling and just do a little body scan from the bottom all the way up. Engage your core just a bit to allow your shoulders to roll back. And as soon as you're done with that, to be alert and mindful of your actual posture via the body scan, now is when we want to take a deep breath in. And this is what we call breathing diaphragmatically. A diaphragmatic breath is one where we start from the lower part of the trunk. So we're looking at the navel area. The breath should start from the lower area. And how we do that is relax your belly. Relax your belly and keep your shoulders drawn below your ears. And breathe in through your nose. And as you breathe in, you want your belly to expand out. So we want to sip in and take in a nice deep breath originating from the belly. So we want to breathe in, push that belly out as much as you can. You're going to sense and feel the sensation is the air is starting from the lower part of your lungs and then working its way up towards the ribs. So we want to start low. And then the natural air flow is going to go back up to a high position by the ribs, the upper ribs. To be able to cue this and do it effectively, you can even put one of your hands on the top part right by your sternum and put your lower hand right on your navel area. And then your lower hand is going to go out first. Your lower hand will move away from your body. And then you do not want to have the movement start from your upper hand, which is on your chest. So breathing deeply is breathing diaphragmatically, which starts from breathing from your belly as deep as you can, taking in some good air, pausing and exhaling slowly. There's hundreds of breathing tempo. One is that we do know we want to breathe slowly. Very commonly to start off with this breath is a 1-to-2 ratio, meaning when you take a deep breath, again, think about grounding yourself, having a body scan to ensure the appropriate posture. And then we want to look at what we just talked about, the mechanics of the breath. The anatomy of a breath is breathing from the belly first. Once you have that down, a couple reps of that, and in fact, it's probably going to take a little bit longer than that, but we want to think about the speed and tempo of breath. And the 1-to-2 ratio could look like something like 4 seconds in. So you would breathe in for 4 seconds, you would pause, and then you would double that. So 1-to-2 ratio would look like 4 seconds in on the inhale, and then 8 seconds slowly out on the exhale. And some people also do what's called box breathing. So you can breathe in for 4 seconds, pause, hold your breath, keep your belly expanded for 4 seconds, and then slowly exhale for 8 seconds. So these two areas are really focused on the mechanics of breathing. Now we're going to go upstream and really look at how we're thinking about our breath. And this is the mindfulness practice of really paying attention in your own particular way. One thing we recommend is to use your breath as an object of your awareness. What that means is to think about and be aware and pay attention to your breath. So as you breathe in, you're going to think about your breath. And we like to use the numbers and the tempo of breath because that gives us a nice piece of an image to actually focus on. Even though everybody's a little bit different, there's many ways that we could use different things to focus on, but the breath is always there with us, and it brings us many other things that are really good, such as it calms us down, it elicits a parasympathetic response, and so there's many other really good things that it does. So as we're doing what we just talked about right here, as you're working on your breathing diaphragmatically, your mind is on your breath. And when your mind or your thought goes somewhere else, the main aim is to be open to that. So really just experience it for whatever it is. And then gently bring your mind back. Bring your mind back to what? Bring your mind back to your breath. Whether it is actually seeing the number, whether you're thinking about how your breath feels, how we think about our breath could be there could be many ways because everybody's a little bit different, but we're essentially using our breath as the object of our awareness. This is called single-pointed mindfulness. So it's as simple as this: standing up or closing your eyes in a relaxed position and breathing deeply from your belly and focusing your mind on your breath. And as soon as your mind wanders, which it will, and we want to bring our mind back to the breath. And we want to do that non-judgmentally, because sometimes we might get upset and label something in an evaluative way because maybe we think we're not doing it right. That's not the practice. The practice is actually incorporating those distractions and those other extraneous thoughts, being aware of them, being open to them, and then gently bringing the mind right back to the breath. And the breath is the object of our awareness. And then really to lock this down in terms of training, there's a lot of different ways. Again, this is about maybe a month and a half to 2 months of training mindfulness with athletes that we're covering here in just about 10 minutes. But there's a couple things we can do. Formal breath and mind, which means there's a formal training that you can go through that's more structured. Think about maybe the next 7 days. It would look like maybe start with 2 minutes all the way up to 5, 6, 10. Starting off with this for 20 minutes, that's really tough. Start with 1 breath. Start with 2 breaths, and then maybe a minute or 2 minutes. But use goal setting with this, right? So we've already talked about goal setting. Set a goal for the next 7 days to work on your mindfulness breathing for maybe a minute or maybe 2 breaths for that particular day. That's formal. That means it's planned. You're isolated. You're going to sit down in a quiet environment and go ahead and go to work when it comes to this. And then informal could be that maybe you're not sitting down on a mat or a pillow, but just throughout the day, you become aware. And maybe even you set a timer on your watch for 30 minutes or maybe an hour throughout the whole day. Every hour it chimes, and then you just go internal, and then you take a deep breath, pause, exhale, and just be where your feet are at, and take mental attendance. See if you're really where your feet are at. And this is a little bit more informal. There's many ways to do this. The key is to find the way that works best for you. All right, guys. So the framework, again here, to pull this together is to train well. That is a physical tool that we look at. Thinking well is cognitive, and then we want to be well. That's a behavioral tool. And the integrative approach is encompassing all of these, but everybody's a little bit different. Some of these might not be for you, and you want to think about what works best for you and incorporate them into your daily practice. And then the last thing here, to conclude, let's go ahead and review. Training well, that is a physical skill that we talked about. Thinking well, cognitive skill, and being well, which is a behavioral skill. And then we have the individual tools that we look at to develop and get better. We want to be as well as we possibly can right now. So we do not want to be prescriptive. That is not my goal, to say, hey, this is the way. This is definitely not that approach, but rather more of an invitation to seek out ways that fit your framework already that you're working from. And how can we get better with that? One thing we do know is that mere exposure to this video, so just kind of watching it passively, might work a little bit. It might entertain you a little bit. You might get a little bit better just because of the insights. But what we're really looking at here is deliberate practice. It is not easy. It takes hard work. It takes time, consistency, grit, some of the things that we've already talked about to be able to target these skills in a consistent and systematic manner. That is what we want to do instead of passively just listening or watching this video. We want to pick something, focus on it, target it for a particular time, and then make sure we make the appropriate adjustments. And when we look at where amateurs part ways with high performers, what we're really looking at here is a space between mere exposure, just listening and watching, that space between that, and then actually deliberate practice is applying this in a very, very deep way that fits you individually. All right, guys, let's bring this home. Hey, one thing that I think is really important to bring up is that stress is not necessarily just a bad thing. Fundamentally, we're not trying to get rid of stress. And even distress that causes some problems is highly adaptive. It becomes maladaptive and stress becomes a problem when we don't use or have the necessary tools and skills to be able to manage our way through and navigate our way through a situation that we're currently in. A couple things to mention too when it comes to mental skills or even physical skills or physical training is that perhaps some of us might think that mental skills such as confidence, mental toughness, optimism, these things are traits or even dispositions. This could not be further from the truth. These are skills, and skills can be learned. And that's one thing that we want to keep front and center in a training video like this, is that there's no shortcuts. Let's get real that these skills that are presented here are not time capsule material. We've all heard of these skills. The difference is how we're actually applying the skills. How do we understand the skills? And then how consistently and targeted and systematically we are able to apply these skills. There are no shortcuts. It takes time. And there's no hacks or tricks. They're not strategies, but they're skills to be learned, and it takes time. And just think about this. Would you want, for example, your pilot, if you're going to go on a long trip across the country, would you want your pilot to be a hack? Would you want them to take shortcuts or maybe use some kind of some very, very quick patchy work or skill to better understand how to fly you safely across the country? And so when we look at these skills, these are learned, and without a doubt, we can develop them. It takes time, and it definitely takes a lot of hard work, but we're definitely worth it. So as we all continue to stay home longer and longer, the war that's being waged is going to happen between the ears. And for most of us, this is an internal civil war that we're going to be going through. And if it's not happened yet, it could rear its head here soon. So think about it. How are you doing right now? How are you processing information? How are you handling your stress? How are you handling this whole situation? How's it working for you? What skills are you using? What skills might work for you that we talked about in this actual training video? And that's the key. We got this. We really do. It just takes time, it takes patience, and it takes a lot of grit and hard work when it comes to figuring out really which skills work for us in terms of how to apply them and how to be able to better stick with them. So I'm fired up. I can't wait to see all you guys back. I can't wait to see you in the pool. Can't wait to see you back on the court, on the floor, and certainly definitely on the field or in the classroom. You guys take care. Have a good one.